Alright, what's going on everyone, and welcome to the series in which I introduce you to all of the most powerful competitive decks in the modern format. The goal here isn't to give exact deck lists as those change constantly, but rather to give a brief overview of how the deck works so you can be prepared if you're new to the format. And today we're looking at, I can't believe I'm saying this, but Tribal Merfolk are a tier 1 deck.
Can't be. It can't be.
It's true. It's true. I don't know how it happened. The perpetual tier 3 casual meme deck and Friday Night Magic champion has officially made it to the realm of tier 1. I'm as surprised as you are. So let's take a look at the Merfolk Lords, because this deck has a whole lot of them. Vodalian Hexcatcher, Master of the Pearl Trident, and Lord of Atlantis. The first pumps your Merfolk, and it has Flash, meaning it can be flashed in to pump your board by surprise, which can lead to some pretty big blowouts, but it can also sacrifice Merfolk to counter non-creature spells. So if your opponent taps out for a big spell, you can play this, sacrifice something to counter it. And once it's on the board, the opponent has to be very careful how they start playing their future spells, because anything can be countered now, so that can sometimes make opponents play slower. Like if they have a board sweeper, they might delay it a turn or two, so they have the mana to pay for the counter spells. So yeah, it's effective, and also it's a Lord that pumps your Merfolk. Master of the Pearl Trident is a typical Lord, although it does give Island Walk, and that's going to be very relevant in just a second. But first we need to talk about Lord of Atlantis, which is very weird. So I'm using a Judge promo image here just because it's the most up-to-date version of the card. This was originally printed in Alpha, Magic's first ever set in the early 90s. Creature types back then didn't make a whole lot of sense, so this is a summon Lord of Atlantis, whatever that means, and it pumps all Merfolk instead of other Merfolk. So the rules text has been updated with the modern lore design, which is to say that it's a Merfolk and it pumps other Merfolk, so it works how you would expect, even if the older printings are really weird. But there's also something fishy with this Merfolk. Notice that it does not say that it pumps other Merfolk you control. Yes, this does indeed pump all Merfolk, even your opponents, which makes Merfolk mirror matches very chaotic, very similar to like Sliver mirror matches. It's weird. But Lord of Atlantis and Master of the Pearl Trident give Island Walk, which means all of your Merfolk are unblockable if the opponent has an island. So if they naturally are playing blue, that's great, but if they aren't, we have Spreading Seas and Tideshaper to ensure they have islands. The first is an aura that will turn the land it enchants into an island, and luckily it draws another card, so it's not a complete waste if the opponent's playing blue. It either makes all your Merfolk unblockable, or it's basically cycled for another card. The Tideshaper is a 1-mana 1/1 that will get +1/+1 if the opponent controls an island, and if you kick it, it does the same thing as Spreading Seas. It turns a land into an island for as long as you control it. So basically against other blue decks, it's a 1-mana 2/2, and against non-blue decks, you have to pay an extra mana for it, but then it's a 2-mana 2/2 that's going to turn a land into an island and make the rest of your stuff unblockable as well if you have a Lord. Now these are already great with the Lords, because when we give all of our creatures Island Walk, they're effectively unblockable if we can turn our opponent's lands into islands. But also keep in mind that turning lands into basic islands is very relevant. Not only can you lock multicolor decks out of certain colors, right? If your opponent's playing like a 3-color deck, you might be able to turn key lands into islands, and they might not have access to certain colors, but it also turns off like creature lands and utility lands. Like Tron, for example. Merfolk can hate out Tron pretty hard by bricking their Tron pieces, and this is true for creature lands and all kinds of stuff, right? Any kind of useful utility land, Merfolk can just turn those into basic islands. The deck has more ways to mess with things though, like Rishadan Dockhand, Merfolk Trickster, and Subtlety. The first can tap lands. Note you can do this on the opponent's turn during their upkeep, so they don't have access to that land during their main phase. And then Merfolk Trickster is another flash Merfolk that, when it enters, will tap a creature and make it lose all abilities. So on the surface, this sounds nice because it can remove blockers and attackers, right? If your creatures aren't unblockable with Island Walk, you can tap down a blocker, or if you're on the defense, you can flash it in before the opponent goes to combat and they can't attack you. But there's way more tricky, weird stuff you can do with this because of the way that it makes the creature lose abilities. Like say your opponent attacks with a flyer, you can flash this in, make it lose flying, and then block it. And this is also true for like Lord effects. If you're playing against another tribal deck, your opponent might attack you thinking their creatures are big, and then you can flash in a Merfolk Trickster and turn off the Lord effect because it's going to lose all abilities, and that might give you good blocks on defense. So this can actually lead to some pretty big blowouts if you use it correctly. It can do some pretty weird stuff. And then Subtlety isn't a Merfolk, but Modern Horizons cards are so powerful that, of course, this deck is playing the incarnation of its color. Boo, lame, whatever. The deck also plays Sphylan, of dubious pronunciation, of Sea and Sky, and Silvergill Adept for card advantage. The first is a 3/4 for 3 mana, which is already good, but it can be indestructible if you control 2 other Merfolk, which should be too difficult in a tribal Merfolk deck. And then whenever it attacks, it draws a card, which is pretty good, especially when it's indestructible, so you don't have to worry about it dying. Or, assuming it's not just unblockable, of course. It also gives all your other Merfolk ward, which makes them more difficult to target, so that's nice. And Silvergill Adept is 2 mana, 2/1, draws a card, basically, which is just fine. Another very important aspect of this deck is Ether Vial, so every turn you have the option to put a charge counter on it, and then you can tap it to put a creature card with equal mana value to the charge counters from your hand straight to the battlefield. Most of the cards in this deck cost 2, so it's very easy to play this card. You usually just leave it on 2, and this allows you to not only play Merfolk super fast, because you can use your mana to cast Merfolk and then get extra ones for free, but also it's notable that this can be activated at any time. So this gives the deck another way to flash Merfolk in at instant speed. So flashing in, Lords to pump your board when your opponent isn't expecting it makes it very difficult to attack into a Merfolk player because, if they have an untapped Ether Vial, you have to just expect that they can flash a Lord in and pump their board, and that makes it very difficult to attack into them. And that's, part of what this deck is doing is it makes it very tricky to play around, but also it is just pumping out power, unblockable power, and attacking very aggressively. And Ether Vial is a major part of that. And then one final card the deck usually plays is Dismember. This is just a removal spell. Mono blue doesn't get a lot of access to removal, of course, so it's playing Dismember because it can pay 2 life for the Phyrexian mana symbols. It's costly, but the deck just needs some way to interact sometimes, and this is usually the choice. I suppose it's also worth noting that some older decks are still running like Harbinger of the Tide and Marrow Regery. These are less common, but they used to be staples. Harbinger is a 2 mana 2/2 that bounces a creature when it enters, and if you pay 2 extra for it, 4 total, you can cast it as an instant. So more Merfolk trickery, common theme here. A lot of decks still play this in the sideboard, but it's less common in the main. The Regery is a Lord that will tap or untap something whenever you play a Merfolk. This used to be a Merfolk staple, but it's a little expensive at 3 mana, and it's largely been replaced with the Curse Catcher recently, so not as common, but maybe you'll still see it sometimes. So, we don't usually go too deep into the mana base and sideboards of these decks, but there are a few notable lands with this one. First, there's Mutable and Cavern of Souls. Mutable can animate into a 2/2 with all creature types, and it can do it for just a single mana, so it gets pumped by your lords, it becomes unblockable with Island Walk, and it's like a 1 mana 2/2 3/3, maybe a 4/4, so pretty good. The Cavern requires you to name a creature type, so naturally we're going to name Merfolk, and then whenever you use it to cast a creature of that type, it cannot be countered. So this is basically just a free way to ensure your Merfolk can't get countered. Perfectly fine. Odawara and Minamo are also frequently played. They're basically islands with extra utility but no drawback if you only play one. The first can be channeled to bounce a creature, and Minamo can untap legendary permanents. We only have one, and that's the card of dubious pronunciation, but it can be untapped, and if you don't have it, it's still basically just an island, so it's fine. And that's it for Merfolk. It has a ton of lords, allowing the deck to produce a ton of power super quickly. It makes all that power unblockable, and it has a lot of tricky ways to mess with your mana base. It has counter spells, has ways to force you to question your own decisions. You don't know if you should attack, you don't know if you can cast something without it being countered. It makes you play awkwardly while putting pressure on you. That's what Merfolk does. If you want exact deck lists, or just the most up-to-date deck lists, be sure to check the description, as I will leave links to metagame tracking websites so you can check those yourself. And if you like this video, I have an entire series dedicated to these modern deck guides, and you can find a link to that as well. But in the meantime, I hope this video was helpful. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.